Melchizedek taught elementary revealed truth at Salem for 94 years, and during this time, Abraham attended the Salem school 3 different times. He finally became a convert to the Salem teachings, becoming one of Melchizedek's most brilliant pupils and chief supporters. 5. The selection of Abraham. Although it may be an error to speak of chosen people, it is not a mistake to refer to Abraham as a chosen individual. Melchizedek did lay upon Abraham the responsibility of keeping alive the truth of one God as distinguished from the prevailing belief in plural deities. The choice of Palestine as the site for Machiavelli's activities was in part predicated upon the desire to establish contact with some human family embodying the potentials of leadership. At the time of the incarnation of Melchizedek, there were many families on earth just as well prepared to receive the doctrine of Salem as was that of Abraham. There were equally endowed families among the red men, the yellow man, and the descendants of the Andites to the west and north. But again, none of these localities were so favorably situated for Michael's subsequent appearance on earth as was the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. The Melchizedek mission in Palestine and the subsequent appearance of Michael among the Hebrew people were in no small measure determined by geography, by the fact that Palestine was centrally located with reference to the then existent trade, travel, and civilization of the world. So, man, we got some beings that live in the spiritual realm. Like they're behind the scenes and they're watching everything. They're more knowledgeable about this material realm than we are. And not only that, they're foreseeing, far seeing. Like they know how things are going to play out years in advance, millennia even. So basically, they some spiritual beings, probably like I don't know, life carriers, the Melchizedeks themselves, the Melchizedeks, their order of being, they knew to look like, okay, this will be a good spot for us to do what we need to do. And they came up to their conclusion based on like trade and just being a central locale at the center of the world, in a sense. Real interesting. Um, For some time, the Melchizedek receivers had been observing the ancestors of Abraham, and they confidently expected offspring in a certain generation who would be characterized by intelligence, initiative, sagacity, and sincerity. Sagacity, wisdom. The children of Terah, the father of Abraham, in every way met these expectations. It was this possibility of contact with these versatile children of Terah that had considerable to do with the appearance of Machiavelli at Salem, rather than in Egypt, China, India, or among the northern tribes. Terah and his whole family were half-hearted converts of the Salem religion, which had been preached in Chaldea. They learned of Melchizedek through the preaching of Ovid, a Phoenician teacher who proclaimed the Salem doctrines in Ur. Ur is like, that was another name for Mesopotamia, like back then. They left Ur intending to go directly through to Salem, but Nahor, Abraham's brother, not having seen Melchizedek, was lukewarm and persuaded them to tarry at Haran. And it was a long time after they arrived in Palestine before they were willing to destroy all of the household gods they had brought with them. They were slow to give up the many gods of Mesopotamia for the one God of Salem. Yeah, I'm on. Probably just be reading a lot of this. A few weeks after the death of Abraham's father, Terah, Melchizedek sent one of his students, Joram the Hittite, to extend this invitation to both Abraham and Nahor. Uh, Come to Salem, where you shall hear our teachings of the truth of the eternal Creator, and in the enlightened offspring of you two brothers shall all the world be blessed. Now Nahor had not wholly accepted the Melchizedek gospel. He remained behind and built up a strong city-state which bore his name. But Lot, Abraham's nephew, decided to go with his uncle to Salem. Upon arriving at Salem, Abraham and Lot chose a hilly fastness near the city where they could defend themselves against the many surprise attacks of northern raiders. At this time, the Hittites, Assyrians, Philistines, and other groups were constantly raiding the tribes of central and southern Palestine. From their stronghold in the hills, Abraham and Lot made frequent pilgrimages to Salem. Not long after they had established themselves near Salem, Abraham and Lot journeyed to the valley of the Nile to obtain food supplies, as there was then a drought in Palestine. During his brief sojourn in Egypt, Abraham found a distant relative on the Egyptian throne, and he served as the commander of two very successful military expeditions for this king. Just, just imagine you come to find out your distant cousin is Pharaoh, and he put you in charge of an army. And that's what happened, essentially. And he served as the commander of two very successful military expeditions for this king. During the latter part of his sojourn on the Nile, he and his wife, Sarah, lived at court, and when leaving Egypt, he was given a share of the spoils of his military campaigns. So that's what really put him on, like in a material sense. These two war campaigns, he got his share of spoils of it. So that really put him on. It required great determination for Abraham to forego the honors of the Egyptian court and return to the more spiritual work sponsored by Machiavelli. But Melchizedek was revered even in Egypt. And when the full story was laid before Pharaoh, he strongly urged Abraham to return to the execution of his vows to the cause of Salem. So yeah, Melchizedek was well known around this time. He was king of Salem. Nobody messed with him. And so, as they say, Abraham left Egypt and Pharaoh and returned back to Salem. Abraham had kingly ambitions, and on the way back from Egypt, he laid before Lot his plan to subdue all Canaan and bring his people under the rule of Salem. Lot was more bent on business, so after a later disagreement, he went to Sodom to engage in trade and animal husbandry. Lot liked neither a military nor a herder's life. Upon returning with his family to Salem, Abraham began to mature his military projects. He was soon recognized as the civil ruler of the Salem territory and had confederated under his leadership 7 nearby tribes. Indeed, it was with great difficulty that Melchizedek restrained Abraham, who was fired with the zeal to go forth and round up the neighboring tribes with the sword, that they might thus more quickly be brought to a knowledge of the Salem truths. So Abraham was about it. You know what I mean? He was a leader, a natural born leader. And they saw all this coming. And that's why he was chosen. Melchizedek maintained peaceful relations with all the surrounding tribes. He was not militaristic and was never attacked by any of the armies as they moved back and forth. He was entirely willing that Abraham should formulate a defensive policy for Salem, such as was subsequently put into effect, but he would not approve of his pupils' ambitious schemes for conquest. So there occurred a friendly severance of relationship. Abraham going over to Hebron to establish his military capital. So he basically was like, I rock with you, OG. I'm just finna do my thing real quick. And that was that. Abraham, because of his close connection with the illustrious Melchizedek, possessed great advantage over the surrounding petty kings. They all revered Melchizedek and unduly feared Abraham. Like they knew Melchizedek was backing him. And even though he was a man of peace, he just had a way about him like you just don't want it with him. Even though it was all peace with Melchizedek. Really, it's just powerful. People recognize he was powerful. Abraham knew of this fear and only awaited an opportune occasion to attack his neighbors. And this excuse came when some of these rulers presumed to raid the property of his nephew Lot, who dwelt in Sodom. Upon hearing of this, Abraham, at the head of his 7 confederated tribes, moved on the enemy. His own bodyguard of 318 officered the army, numbering more than 4,000, was struck at this time. When Melchizedek heard of Abraham's declaration of war, he went forth to dissuade him, but only caught up with his former disciple as he returned victorious from the battle. Abraham insisted that the God of Salem had given him victory over his enemies and persisted in giving 1/10 of his spoils to the Salem treasury. The other 90% he removed to his capital at Hebron. After this battle of Siddim, Abraham became leader of a second confederation of 11 tribes and not only paid tithes to Melchizedek, but saw to it that all others in that vicinity did the same. His diplomatic dealings with the king of Sodom, together with the fear in which he was so generally held, resulted in the king of Sodom and others joining the Hebron military confederation. Abraham was really well on the way to establishing a powerful state in Palestine. So Abraham was on a quest for power, for sure. And he was powerful because everybody in that region feared Melchizedek, and they knew him and Melchizedek were tight. 6, Melchizedek's covenant with Abraham. This is important right here. Abraham envisaged the conquest of all Canaan. His determination was only weakened by the fact that Melchizedek would not sanction the undertaking. But Abraham had about decided to embark upon the enterprise when the thought that he had no son to succeed him as ruler of this proposed kingdom began to worry him. He arranged another conference with Melchizedek, and it was in the course of this interview that the priest of Salem, the visible Son of God, persuaded Abraham to abandon his scheme of material conquest and temporal rule in favor of the spiritual concept of the kingdom of heaven. Melchizedek explained to Abraham the futility of contending with the Amorite confederation, but made it equally clear that these backward clans were certainly committing suicide by their foolish practices, so that in a few generations they would be so weakened that the descendants of Abraham, meanwhile greatly increased, could easily overcome them. And Melchizedek made a formal covenant with Abraham at Salem. Said he to Abraham, "Look up now to the heavens and number the stars if you are able. So numerous shall your seed be." And Abraham believed Melchizedek, and it was counted to him for righteousness. And this Melchizedek told Abraham the story of the future occupation of Canaan by his offspring after their sojourn in Egypt. So he prophesied to him what was going to come of his people in the future. This covenant of Melchizedek with Abraham represents the great Urantian agreement between divinity and humanity, whereby God agrees to do everything. Man only agrees to believe God's promises and follow his instructions. Heretofore, it had been believed that salvation could be secured only by works, sacrifices, and offerings. Now, Melchizedek again brought to Urantia the good news that salvation, favor with God, is to be had by faith. But this gospel of simple faith in God was too advanced. The Semitic tribesmen subsequently preferred to go back to the older sacrifices and atonement for sin by the shedding of blood. So that's self-explanatory, but what Melchizedek is telling him is, again, you don't have to do all these sacrifices and burnt offerings or any of that. You don't have to bring that forth to God. He's not concerned about any of that. Your belief is simply enough, and that I just couldn't comprehend that at that time. And so subsequently, they got back to shedding blood for atonement. It was not long after the establishment of this covenant that Isaac, the son of Abraham, was born in accordance with the promise of Melchizedek. After the birth of Isaac, Abraham took a very solemn attitude toward his covenant with Melchizedek, going over to Salem to have it stated in writing. It was at this public and formal acceptance of the covenant that he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. Most of the Salem believers had practiced circumcision, though it had never been made obligatory by Melchizedek. Now, Abraham had always so opposed circumcision that on this occasion he decided to solemnize the event. Solemnize, it's a solemn occasion. They say solemnize the event by formally accepting this rite in token of the ratification of the Salem covenant. So he had Isaac circumcised, which prior to this wasn't a big deal to him. He didn't really believe in it, but this Melchizedek covenant meant so much to him that he wanted to basically do something different in it. That was it, even though this was never required by Melchizedek. Nonetheless, it was following his real and public surrender of his personal ambitions in behalf of the larger plans of Melchizedek that the three celestial beings appeared to him on the plains of Mamre. This was an appearance of fact, notwithstanding its association with the subsequently fabricated narratives relating to the natural destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these legends of the happenings of those days indicate how retarded were the morals and ethics of even so recent a time. Upon the consummation of the solemn covenant, the reconciliation between Abraham and Melchizedek was complete. Abraham again assumed the civil and military leadership of the Salem colony, which at its height carried over 100,000 regular tithe payers on the rolls of the Melchizedek Brotherhood. Abraham greatly improved the Salem temple and provided new tents for the entire school. He not only extended the tithing system, but also instituted many improved methods of conducting the business of the school, besides contributing greatly to the better handling of the Department of Missionary Propaganda. He also did much to effect improvement on herds, and it's really not necessary. Abraham was a shrewd and efficient businessman, a wealthy man for his day. He was not overly pious, but he was thoroughly sincere, and he did believe in Machiavellian Melchizedek. So to briefly summarize that, Melchizedek, the school, like his institution, he pretty much built, the school and the whole colony of Salem, it had about 100,000 active members at this time. So they're already starting to be a people. Part 7, the Melchizedek missionaries. Melchizedek continued for some years to instruct his students and train the Salem missionaries who penetrated to all the surrounding tribes, especially to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor. And as the decades passed, these teachers journeyed farther and farther from Salem, carrying with them Machiavelli's gospel of belief and faith in God. Again, remember, this is important. Melchizedek's whole mission is to bring the idea of monotheism to a people in order to prepare a way for the later Son of God that they know is coming. The descendants of Adamson, clustered about the shores of the Lake of Van, were willing listeners to the Hittite teachers of the Salem cult. They pretty much are just saying how they sent out a lot of missionaries throughout the world, the known world back then. Melchizedek had a whole bunch of missionaries that went out into Asia, Africa, and Eurasia. But they do go on to say the task was so great and the tribes were so backward that the results were vague and indefinite. From one generation to another, the Salem gospel found lodgment here and there, but except in Palestine, never was the idea of one God able to claim the continued allegiance of a whole tribe or race. Long before the coming of Jesus, the teachings of the early Salem missionaries had become generally submerged in the older and more universal superstitions and beliefs. The original Melchizedek gospel had been almost wholly absorbed in the beliefs in the Great Mother, the Sun, and other ancient cults. So basically, at that time, people were either into some mother worship, the sun, or some other strange ideas. And it was just hard to supplant their initial ideas with this idea of one God. This interest. You who today enjoy the advantages of the art of printing little understand how difficult it was to perpetuate truth during these earlier times, how easy it was to lose sight of a new doctrine from one generation to another. There was always a tendency for the new doctrine to become absorbed into the older body of religious teaching and magical practice. A new revelation is always contaminated by the older evolutionary beliefs. 8. Departure of Melchizedek. It was shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that Machiavellian Melchizedek decided to end his emergency bestowal on Urantia. Melchizedek's decision to terminate his sojourn in the flesh was influenced by numerous conditions, chief of which was the growing tendency of the surrounding tribes and even of his immediate associates to regard him as a demigod, to look upon him as a supernatural being, which indeed he was, but they were beginning to reverence him unduly and with a highly superstitious fear. They just started doing too much in their reverence for him. So he was like, I gotta go, man. In addition to these reasons, Melchizedek wanted to leave the scene of his earthly activities a sufficient length of time before Abraham's death to ensure that the truth of the one and only God would become strongly established in the mind of his followers. Accordingly, Machiavelli retired one night to his tent at Salem, having said goodnight to his human companions, and when they went to call him in the morning, he was not there, for his fellows had taken him. Bruh, he went to sleep one night, retired at the tent, never came out, disappeared. The other Melchizedeks had restored him to their order of being. He vanished. Man, I know that fucked people up. 9. After Melchizedek's departure, it was a great trial for Abraham when Melchizedek so suddenly disappeared. Although he had fully warned his followers that he must sometime go as he had come, they were not reconciled to the loss of their wonderful leader. The great organization built up at Salem nearly disappeared, though the traditions of these days were what Moses built upon when he led the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. The loss of Melchizedek produced a sadness in the heart of Abraham that he never fully overcame. Hebron he had abandoned when he gave up the ambition of building a material kingdom. And now, upon the loss of his associate in the building of the spiritual kingdom, he departed from Salem, going south to live near his interest at Gerar. Abraham became fearful and timid immediately after the disappearance of Melchizedek. He withheld his identity upon arrival at Gerar so that Abimelech appropriated his wife. I forget how you say this. Abimelech. But yeah, Abraham was married to Sarah. And they have in parentheses, shortly after his marriage to Sarah, Abraham one night had overheard a plot to murder him in order to get his brilliant wife. This dread became a terror, so the otherwise brave and daring leader, all his life he feared that someone would kill him secretly in order to get Sarah. And this explains why, on 3 separate occasions, this brave man exhibited real cowardice. But Abraham was not long to be deterred in his mission as the successor of Melchizedek. Soon he made converts among the Philistines and of Abimelech's people, made a treaty with them, and in turn became contaminated with many of their superstitions, particularly with their practice of sacrificing firstborn sons. Thus did Abraham again become a great leader in Palestine. He was held in reverence by all groups and honored by all kings. He was the spiritual leader of all the surrounding tribes, and his influence continued for some time after his death. During the closing years of his life, he once more returned to Hebron, the scene of his early activities and the place where he had worked in association with Melchizedek. Abraham's last act was to send trusty servants to the city of his brother Nahor on the border of Mesopotamia to secure a woman of his own people as a wife for his son Isaac. It had long been the custom of Abraham's people to marry their cousins, and Abraham died confident in that faith in God which he had learned from Melchizedek in the vanished schools of Salem. It was hard for the next generation to comprehend the story of Melchizedek. Within 500 years, many regarded the whole narrative as a myth. Isaac held fairly well to the teachings of his father and nourished the gospel of the Salem colony, but it was harder for Jacob to grasp the significance of these traditions. Joseph was a firm believer in Melchizedek and was largely because of this regarded by his brothers as a dreamer, just because he believed in Melchizedek. And I'm sure, if you're familiar with the Bible, you've heard that said about Joseph being a dreamer. Joseph's honor in Egypt was chiefly due to the memory of his great-grandfather Abraham. Joseph was offered military command of the Egyptian armies, but being such a firm believer in the traditions of Melchizedek and the later teachings of Abraham and Isaac, he elected to serve as a civil administrator, believing that he could thus better labor for the advancement of the kingdom of heaven. Everybody give a little backstory on how the teachings of Melchizedek and information about him has got lost over the years, and I'm gonna kind of skip through it a little bit. I'm gonna pick and choose rather. The teaching of Melchizedek was full and replete, but the records of these days seemed impossible and fantastic to the later Hebrew priests, although many had some understanding of these transactions, at least up to the times of the en masse editing of the Old Testament records in Babylon. What the Old Testament records describe as conversations between Abraham and God were in reality conferences between Abraham and Melchizedek. Later scribes regarded the term Melchizedek as synonymous with God. The record of so many contacts of Abraham and Sarah with the quote, the angel of the Lord, refers to their numerous visits with Melchizedek. The Hebrew narratives of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are far more reliable than those about Abraham, although they also contain many diversions from the facts, alterations made intentionally and unintentionally at the time of the compilation of these records by the Hebrew priests during the Babylonian captivity. So at this time, while they were slaves in Babylon, the Hebrew people, the priest class, were putting together different narratives about their story, and already they're taking some things out and putting some things in. And they go on to explain some of that, and I think people familiar with the Bible should definitely check out this paper and some of these things that I'm skipping over because they definitely go into detail. But I'm really not going into detail because I know so many these days aren't familiar with the Bible. And hell, I ain't no expert. But check this. The national ego of the Jews was tremendously depressed by the Babylonian captivity. In their reaction against national inferiority, they swung to the other extreme of national and racial egotism, in which they distorted and perverted their traditions with the view of exalting themselves above all races as the chosen people of God. And hence, they carefully edited all their records for the purpose of raising Abraham and their other national leaders high up above all other persons, not accepting Melchizedek himself. The Hebrew scribes therefore destroyed every record of these momentous times which they could find, preserving only the narrative of the meeting of Abraham and Melchizedek after the battle of Siddim, which they deemed reflected great honor upon Abraham. Yo, they said a word there, bro. So during their captivity in Babylon, these Jews were putting together a narrative that suited their pride more so than anything. And they were willing to reject certain things and truths in order to exalt themselves as a people. That's deep, bro. And thus, in losing sight of Melchizedek, they also lost sight of the teaching of this emergency son regarding the spiritual mission of the promised bestowal son. Lost sight of the nature of this mission so fully and completely that very few of their progeny were able or willing to recognize and receive Michael when he appeared on earth and in the flesh, as Machiavelli had foretold. They saying some, man, this is heavy. But one of the writers of the book of Hebrews understood the mission of Melchizedek, for it is written, quote, this Melchizedek, priest of the Most High, was also king of peace, without father, without mother, without pedigree, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like a son of God, he abides a priest continually. This is in the Bible, in the book of Hebrews. So basically, they're saying, regardless of what took place, some of this still managed to slip in. The writer designated Melchizedek as a type of the later bestowal of Michael, affirming that Jesus was a, quote, minister forever on the order of Melchizedek, end quote, again in the Bible. While this comparison was not altogether fortunate, it was literally true that Christ did receive provisional title to Urantia, quote, upon the orders of the 12 Melchizedek receivers, end quote, on duty at the time of his world bestowal. So what they just said, in the Bible, it refers to Jesus being a minister forever on the order of Melchizedek, like he's after Melchizedek. And it's a real obscure word or phrase in the Bible, but that means a lot. So again, he doesn't show up much in there, but every time he does, it's an indication of some real power. But he wasn't after the order of Melchizedek. Michael is above Melchizedek in the spiritual hierarchy of things. But since he came down here during his bestowal and took the title of planetary prince from them, because remember, they took hold and control of the planet after Adam and Eve defaulted. So here they were back. The 12 Melchizedek receivers were again back in position as the world rulers and at the top of the spiritual hierarchy for this planet until Michael came down here and ended up being designated the planetary prince on top of everything else. So we're going to get to Michael and his power real soon and what it all means. But they really just clarified something major and something that's been confounding people for a long time. They just really brought some clarity to. Part 10. Present status of Makavena Melchizedek. During the years of Makavena's incarnation, the Urantia Melchizedek receivers functioned as 11. When Makavena considered that his mission as an emergency son was finished, he signalized this fact to his 11 associates, and they immediately made ready the technique whereby he was to be released from the flesh and safely restored to his original Melchizedek status. And on the third day after his disappearance from Salem, he appeared among his 11 fellows of the Urantia assignment and resumed his uninterrupted career as one of the planetary receivers of 606 of Satania. Makavena terminated his bestowal as a creature of flesh and blood just as suddenly and unceremoniously as he had begun it. Neither his appearance nor departure were accompanied by any unusual announcement or demonstration. Neither resurrection roll call nor ending of planetary dispensation marked his appearance on Urantia. His was an emergency bestowal. I was trying to go back to some because I wanted to talk. When they said neither resurrection roll call, again, I mentioned, and they call it planetary dispensation period. These are major events in the history of the planet, and oftentimes it coincides with a resurrection of the dead. Like, supposing you die and you pretty much you're in this unconscious state for a long time until a dispensational resurrection, which happens every so often. And that's when you face your judgment. Let's see. So he was basically returned again to the other 11, and it's again 12 Melchizedeks who watch over this planet. Makavena terminated his bestowal as a creature of flesh and blood just as suddenly and unceremoniously as he had begun it. And I went over that already. I talked about his was an emergency bestowal, so it wasn't coinciding with any sort of planetary dispensation or resurrection. But Makavena did not end his sojourn in the flesh of human beings until he had been duly released by the father Melchizedek and had been informed that his emergency bestowal had received the approval of the chief executive of Nebadon, Gabriel of Salvington. Basically, they had to say, yeah, you did good, bro. Come on back. Machiavelli Melchizedek continued to take a great interest in the affairs of the descendants of those men who had believed in his teachings when he was in the flesh. But the progeny of Abraham through Isaac, as intermarried with the Kenites, were the only line which long continued to nourish any clear concept of the Salem teachings. This same Melchizedek continued to collaborate throughout the 19 succeeding centuries with the many prophets and seers, thus endeavoring to keep alive the truths of Salem until the fullness of the time for Michael's appearance on earth. So somehow or another, he wasn't in the flesh, but still managed to, as they say, collaborate with the prophets who all came before Michael. A long list of Hebrew prophets. Machiavelli continued as a planetary receiver up to the times of the triumph of Michael on Urantia. Subsequently, he was attached to the Urantia service on Jerusalem as one of the 24 directors, and that's a council who pretty much looks over Urantia. They're like a real high governing body of our planet. This council of 24. That's even in the Bible as well. And they're saying he belongs on that council. He's been elevated to this position of personal ambassador on Jerusalem of the Creator's Son, bearing the title Vicegerent, Planetary Prince of Urantia. So he's also the planetary prince in a sense, even though Michael technically is vicegerent, means a stand-in. So he can stand in as far as planetary prince is concerned of our planet. I know, man. It's order out here, bro. That's really what we got to understand. Like, this ain't haphazard. Even though our planet is in chaos, bro, it comes from order. And there's order that supersedes all of this. And there's different personalities and beings who are working on behalf of the universal Father of our creation. I'm finna briefly. It is our belief that as long as Urantia remains as an inhabited planet, Machiavelli Melchizedek will not be fully returned to the duties of his order of sonship, but will remain, speaking in the terms of time, forever a planetary minister representing Christ Michael. So, I mean, he's a stand-in for Christ Michael, who's the planetary prince of this planet since his bestowal. But he's out running the whole universe. So Melchizedek can fill in. As his was an emergency bestowal on Urantia, it does not appear from the records what Machiavelli's future may be. It may develop that the Melchizedek core of Nebadon have sustained the permanent loss of one of their number. Recent rulings, well, I don't want to get into that. It's a little bit heady. But they're basically alluding to the fact that he's, since the fallen planetary prince Caligastia, Melchizedek is destined to take that place as planetary prince for the foreseeable future. So really, man, they just get into a lot of politics in the next few paragraphs that, while interesting, may be a little bit, dense. So I'm just going to pretty much close this on out. This is the story of Makavena Melchizedek, one of the most unique of all characters ever to become connected with the history of Urantia, and a personality who may be destined to play an important role in the future experience of your irregular and unusual world. Presented by a Melchizedek of Nebadon.